The alarm on Marcus Webb's radio crackled at 3 in the morning, and his heart jumped before his mind even caught up. A motion sensor had triggered in the East Wing, a part of the palace that had been closed for renovation for nearly a year. No one was supposed to be there. No one was ever supposed to be there. He grabbed his flashlight and moved fast down the marble corridor, his boots echoing off walls lined with paintings of kings and queens who had been dead for centuries. He reached the sealed door at the end of the hallway, breathing hard, and pressed his hand against it. Locked. Untouched. The sensor must have picked up nothing more than a rat or a draft slipping through old brick, he told himself. But something about the silence on the other side felt wrong, heavier than an empty room should feel. He radioed the control room. Static answered him first, then a tired voice confirmed there was no other guard scheduled for that corridor tonight. Marcus was alone. He stood there a long moment, torn between walking away and finishing what his job required him to do. 20 years of service had taught him one thing above all else. Ignore a strange feeling in this palace, and you would regret it later. He unlocked the door. Dust rose in a soft cloud as it creaked open, and his flashlight beam cut through the dark like a blade. Sheets covered old furniture, shaped like ghosts frozen mid-motion. Marcus stepped inside carefully, sweeping his light along the walls, searching for whatever had set off the sensor. Nothing moved. No rat, no draft, nothing broken, just stillness, and the smell of a room that had not breathed fresh air in a very long time. Then his light caught something odd along the far wall, a section of brick that did not quite match the rest, slightly recessed, as though it had been added long after the original room was built. He walked closer, running his fingers along the seam where the mismatched bricks met the older stone. His pulse quickened. In all his years walking these halls, he had never noticed a hidden wall in this wing. He should have called it in right then. He should have written a report and let the engineers handle it in the morning. But a strange, quiet curiosity had already taken hold of him, the same kind of pull that makes a person open a door marked private, just to see what waits behind it. He found a loose brick near the bottom, wiggled it free, and felt cool air brush against his fingers from the other side. A hollow space. Not just a wall, a room. Marcus called his supervisor, a steady woman named Charlotte Briggs who had worked palace security even longer than he had. She arrived within 20 minutes, flashlight in hand, expression unreadable as she examined the brickwork herself. "This wasn't in any of the original blueprints," she said quietly. "Not the ones I've seen, anyway. They decided to open it properly, carefully, using a small crowbar from the maintenance closet instead of tearing it apart. Brick by brick, they worked in silence, sweat gathering on both their brows despite the night chill, until a gap wide enough for a person appeared. Marcus shone his light through first. Inside was a closet, no larger than a small bedroom, built with fine wood paneling that had once been beautiful before decades of dust dulled its shine. A single rail ran along one wall, and on that rail hung one dress. It was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen, even in the grand exhibition halls where old royal garments were sometimes displayed for visitors. The fabric held a deep, rich color that seemed to shift between blue and violet, depending on how the light struck it, and delicate embroidery ran along the sleeves in patterns that looked hand-stitched, thread by careful thread. It looked untouched by time, as though someone had wrapped it in care before sealing this room away forever. Charlotte stepped in beside him, her flashlight beam settling on the gown. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "There's no plaque," Marcus finally said. "No tag, nothing marking whose it was." Charlotte crouched near the base of the rail, examining a small wooden chest tucked beneath it. She lifted the lid slowly, revealing a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, resting on top of a pair of gloves and a faded photograph. She unfolded the paper carefully, her eyes scanning the elegant, looping handwriting. "It's a letter," she said. "No name signed at the bottom." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, and though the ink had faded in places, some of the words were still legible. The letter spoke of a promise broken, a family's disappointment, and a departure that could never be undone. It mentioned no names, no dates, nothing that could easily identify who had written it or who it had been written to. But the sorrow in those words was unmistakable, bleeding through even after all these years. Charlotte folded the letter back with great care, as though it might crumble if handled too roughly. "We need to report this through the proper channels," she said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "Chief Administrator will want to know immediately." Marcus nodded, but something inside him hesitated. In all his years serving the palace, following every rule without question, he had never once stumbled upon something the institution itself seemed to have tried so hard to erase. A bricked-over room, a dress with no record, a letter with no name. Someone had wanted this hidden, and hidden well. They sealed the opening loosely with a tarp for the night, and agreed to report it first thing in the morning, once the right people were awake and available. Charlotte insisted they follow procedure exactly, careful not to disturb anything further, careful not to speak of it to anyone outside the necessary chain of command. But as Marcus walked back to his post that night, his mind kept circling back to the dress hanging in that hidden room, undisturbed for what looked like decades. Someone had once worn that gown. Someone had once mattered enough to own something so beautifully made. And yet the palace itself, with all its careful records and endless archives, seemed to have no memory of her at all. He thought of the letter's words, the mention of a promise broken and a departure that could never be undone. Whoever she was, she had not simply been forgotten by accident. She had been removed, deliberately, from the story of this place. And something about that truth settled uneasily in Marcus's chest, refusing to let him rest. The next morning, the chief administrator, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Edmund Hale, arrived to inspect the hidden room himself. He examined the dress, the letter, and the photograph, with a practiced calm that told Marcus this was not the reaction of a man discovering something entirely unexpected. "This will be handled internally," Edmund said, folding his hands behind his back. "I'll need both of you to keep this matter confidential until we've properly assessed it." Marcus opened his mouth to ask a question, but the look on Edmund's face closed the conversation before it could begin. Whatever this discovery meant, it clearly mattered to someone still very much alive today, someone with enough authority to want it quietly contained rather than openly explained. As the room was cordoned off and marked for official review, Marcus found himself staring one last time at the gown hanging alone in the dim light. He did not know her name yet, this woman whose life had been folded away behind brick and silence. But he knew, with a certainty he could not quite explain, that he would not be able to walk away from this mystery so easily. Whoever she was, her story was not finished. Not yet. And somehow, without ever meaning to, Marcus had become the one holding the thread that might finally unravel it. Marcus could not stop thinking about the dress. 2 days after the discovery, he found himself standing outside the palace archive building during his break, hands in his pockets, working up the nerve to knock. Inside worked a woman named Beatrice Lang, a records keeper who had helped him once before when he needed old maintenance files for a leaking pipe in the West Corridor. She was sharp, thorough, and more importantly, she liked a good puzzle. She listened carefully as Marcus described the hidden room, the dress, and the unsigned letter, careful not to mention Edmund's instructions to keep things quiet. When he finished, Beatrice sat back in her chair, tapping a pen against her desk. "A sealed room with no blueprint record," she said slowly. "That's not something that happens by accident in a palace like this. Every wall, every closet, every broom cupboard gets logged somewhere." "That's what I thought," Marcus said. "So either the records were destroyed, or someone removed them on purpose," Beatrice finished. She agreed to look through the older archive files, the ones stored in the basement vaults that few people bothered with anymore, since most records had been digitized decades ago. It would take some digging, she warned him, but if anything remained of that section of the palace's history, she would find it. 2 days later, she called him down to the archive basement, her expression a mixture of excitement and unease. Spread across her desk were several documents, some crumbling at the edges, others simply faded beyond easy reading. "I found floor plans from before the renovation," she said, pointing to a rolled-up blueprint. This part of the East Wing used to be a private set of rooms, reserved for family members who needed extra privacy. Guest quarters, some called them. But look here. She unrolled a second, older document, dated decades earlier than the first. This one shows the same space, except it includes the room you found. Then compare it to this later version. She placed a third blueprint beside it. The room simply disappears. No demolition record, no renovation note. It just vanishes from the paperwork, like it was erased rather than removed. Marcus studied the documents carefully, his mind turning over the implications. Someone had gone through the trouble of updating official palace records to remove any trace that the room had ever existed. That kind of alteration required access, authority, and a very specific reason. "Do the plans mention who used those guest quarters?" Marcus asked. Beatrice shook her head, not by name, but there's a ledger from the household staff around that same period, listing meals and supplies delivered to different parts of the palace. I found an entry for that wing that stops abruptly, the same year the room disappears from the blueprints. She handed him a photocopy of the ledger page. Marcus scanned the neat handwriting, listing simple details, meals, linens, and, near the bottom, a note about a seamstress being sent to fit a young woman for several new gowns. No name was given, only a title, The Young Miss. "The Young Miss," Marcus repeated. "That's not exactly specific." "No," Beatrice agreed, "but it does tell us something. Whoever she was young, and she was important enough to warrant a personal seamstress and a private set of rooms. That's not staff, that's family, or close to it." Marcus thought of the gown hanging in that hidden closet, the fine embroidery, the careful stitching. It matched the kind of attention a personal seamstress might give a young woman of importance. Over the following week, Marcus found himself returning to the archive during every spare moment he had, helping Beatrice sort through boxes of aging paperwork. They found scattered references to the same wing, but always vague, always careful to avoid specifics. It was as though whoever had once documented these events had learned, over time, to write around the truth rather than through it. Eventually, Beatrice suggested something that made Marcus hesitate. "There's a woman named Margaret Wells," she said. "She used to serve as a lady-in-waiting here, retired now, but she worked in the palace during roughly the same period these documents come from. If anyone remembers something the paperwork doesn't say, it would be her." Marcus felt a flicker of nervous excitement. Speaking to a former staff member about a matter Edmund had specifically asked him to keep quiet felt like crossing a line he could not easily walk back from. But the pull of the mystery had grown too strong to ignore. They found Margaret Wells living in a small cottage on the outskirts of the city, her garden neatly kept despite her advanced age. When Marcus and Beatrice explained why they had come, careful to keep the details vague at first, the older woman's expression shifted in a way that told them she understood exactly what they were asking about, even before they said too much. "I wondered if anyone would ever ask," Margaret said quietly, inviting them inside. Over tea, she spoke slowly, choosing her words with obvious care. "There was a young woman who lived in the palace many years ago," Margaret began. "She was closely connected to the family, though not spoken of publicly. Even then, bright, kind, full of life. She loved that dress you're describing, wore it to a private gathering once, and I remember thinking I had never seen anyone look quite so happy." "What happened to her?" Marcus asked gently. Margaret's hands tightened slightly around her teacup. There was a decision made, one that involved her future, her place within the family. She did not agree with it. There was a disagreement, a serious one, though I was never told the full details. Shortly after, she was gone, sent away, I believe, though no one ever said where or why exactly. "And the room?" Beatrice asked. "Closed up not long after," Margaret said. "I always assumed it was simply because no one wanted to be reminded of what happened. Grief and shame have a way of making people want to seal things away rather than face them." Marcus leaned forward. "Do you know her name?" Margaret hesitated, glancing between them as though weighing how much she was willing to share. I knew her only by a name used among the staff, one that was not necessarily her given name. We called her Miss Rowan, though I always suspected that was not what her family called her in private. Is she still alive? Marcus asked. I do not know, Margaret admitted. I have often wondered over the years whether she found happiness somewhere else, away from all of this. But I never heard from her again after she left, and eventually people stopped speaking of her altogether, as though speaking her name might invite trouble. Marcus sat back, processing everything Margaret had shared. A young woman connected to the royal family, sent away following a disagreement, her existence carefully erased from official memory. It matched everything the letter and the hidden room suggested, yet so much remained unknown. Why exactly had she been sent away? What decision had she refused to accept? And most importantly, was she still out there somewhere, unaware that the palace guard patrolling the very halls she once called home had stumbled upon the last physical trace of her existence? Before they left, Margaret placed a gentle hand on Marcus's arm. Be careful with this, she warned. Some silences exist because people wanted peace, not because they wanted secrets kept forever. But other silences exist because someone is still trying to protect themselves, even now. You should think carefully about which kind of silence you are dealing with before you go any further. Marcus thanked her, though her warning lingered uncomfortably in his mind the entire ride back to the palace. He and Beatrice said little to each other, both aware that what had started as simple curiosity had become something far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. That night, back at his post, Marcus found himself standing outside the sealed section of the East Wing once more, staring at the tarp covering the opening they had made. Somewhere beyond that brick and dust, a dress still hung, waiting, as though frozen in the exact moment its owner had been forced to leave it behind. Marcus thought of Miss Rowan, a name that might not even be real, and wondered how many other secrets this palace held behind its polished walls and carefully maintained appearances. He did not yet know that his search had already caught the attention of people far more powerful than Margaret Wells, people who had spent decades ensuring this particular story remained buried, and who would not appreciate a palace guard and an archivist unraveling it thread by careful thread. A week passed before Marcus noticed the first sign that something had shifted. Edmund Hale, usually reserved but polite, began greeting him with a stiffness that had not existed before. Small comments followed, offhand remarks about focusing on his actual duties rather than wandering into matters outside his role. Marcus said nothing in response, but the message was clear enough. Someone had noticed his visits to the archive, and possibly his trip to see Margaret Wells as well. Rather than retreat, Marcus found himself more determined than ever to understand the full story. He returned to Beatrice, who had continued quietly searching through older records whenever her schedule allowed. She met him in a quiet corner of the archive basement, several folders spread across the table between them. I found something, she said, her voice lower than usual. A newspaper clipping tucked inside a folder that had nothing to do with the royal family at all. I think someone hid it there deliberately, hoping no one would think to look. She slid the brittle, yellowed clipping toward him. The headline was vague, mentioning a private family matter resolved quietly, with no further details given. But a small photograph accompanied the article, showing a young woman standing slightly apart from a group of formally dressed relatives, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes betraying something closer to sorrow. Marcus stared at the photograph, comparing it in his mind to the dress hanging in that hidden closet. Though the picture was in black and white, he could almost imagine the fabric shifting between blue and violet under proper light. "Do you think that's her?" he asked. "Miss Rowan?" "I think it might be," Beatrice said. "But there's something else. Look at the man standing just behind her." Marcus examined the photograph more closely. An older man, dignified, his posture rigid with formality, stood a few steps behind the young woman, his expression unreadable. Something about his stance suggested authority rather than warmth, control rather than affection. "Any idea who he is?" Marcus asked. Beatrice hesitated before answering. "I believe that's Arthur Whitmore." He served as an advisor to the royal family for decades, retired now, but still highly respected within certain circles. If anyone orchestrated whatever happened to Miss Rowan, it may have been him. Marcus felt a chill settle over him. Arthur Whitmore was not simply a retired advisor. He remained a powerful presence within palace affairs, occasionally consulted on matters of family tradition and protocol, even after stepping down from his official role. If he had been involved in sending Miss Rowan away, he would almost certainly still have influence enough to protect that secret today. "We need to be careful," Beatrice said, echoing Margaret's earlier warning. "If Whitmore is involved, and if he's the reason Edmund has been acting differently toward you, then someone with real power already knows we're looking into this." Despite the growing sense of caution, neither of them was willing to abandon the search now. Marcus suggested trying to find out more about what had happened to Miss Rowan after she left the palace, reasoning that if she was still alive, she might be the only person who could offer answers that no document or ledger ever would. Over the following days, Beatrice combed through old shipping manifests, travel records, and correspondence archives, searching for any mention of a young woman matching the vague description they had gathered. It felt like searching for a single thread in an enormous, tangled cloth, but eventually she found something promising. A record from a private estate located far from the palace, in a quiet coastal town, listed the arrival of a young woman under the name Eleanor Rowan, arriving decades earlier under circumstances described only as a family arrangement. The estate had since changed ownership several times, but property records suggested the original owner had maintained close ties to the royal family during that period. "Eleanor Rowan," Marcus repeated softly. "That has to be her." Beatrice nodded, though her expression remained cautious. If she settled there, she may still have family or acquaintances in the area, even if she has passed on herself by now. It's worth investigating, but we'll need to be discreet. If Whitmore or Edmund learn we've traced her this far, they may try to stop us before we get any closer to the truth. Marcus requested a few days of leave, explaining to his supervisor Charlotte only that he needed to attend to a personal matter. Charlotte, who had grown noticeably quieter about the entire situation since their initial discovery, studied him carefully before approving the request, though she offered a quiet warning of her own. "Whatever you're chasing," she said, "remember that some truths cost more to uncover than people expect." Be careful, Marcus. He traveled to the coastal town with Beatrice, both of them posing as historians researching old estate properties, a cover story simple enough to avoid suspicion. The town was small, quiet, filled with narrow streets and salt-tinged air. They found the estate easily enough, now converted into a small countryside inn, its original grandeur faded but still visible in the architecture. The innkeeper, an elderly man named Henry Ashcroft, welcomed them warmly, more than happy to share what he knew about the estate's history when Marcus mentioned they were researching old royal connections. "My grandmother worked here as a housekeeper many years ago," Henry explained, guiding them through the sitting room, decorated with old photographs. "She used to speak of a young woman who came to live here for a time, sent by the royal family under mysterious circumstances. Eleanor, I believe her name was." Marcus exchanged a glance with Beatrice. "Do you know what happened to her?" Marcus asked carefully. Henry's expression softened with something close to sympathy. "She lived here for several years, quietly, away from public attention. My grandmother said she was kind, gentle, though clearly carrying a heavy sadness with her. Eventually she married a local man, a fisherman, and left the estate to build a simple life of her own." "Is she still alive?" Beatrice asked. Henry shook his head slowly. "She passed away some years ago, I'm afraid, but she has a daughter, still living in town, I believe, runs a small bakery near the harbor." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. A daughter meant a living connection, someone who might know pieces of the story that no document could ever reveal. They thanked Henry and made their way toward the harbor, following his directions until they found a small bakery tucked between two weathered buildings, the scent of fresh bread drifting into the street. Inside, A woman in her middle years, with kind eyes and flour dusted along her apron, greeted them with a warm, easy smile. Her name was Grace Whitfield, and when Marcus gently explained that they were researching her mother's history, careful to avoid overwhelming her with too much information at once, Grace's expression shifted into something thoughtful, almost relieved. "My mother rarely spoke about her early life," Grace admitted, wiping her hands on her apron as she led them to a quiet table near the back of the shop. "But before she passed, she gave me a small box of belongings, telling me it held pieces of a life she had once been forced to leave behind. I never fully understood what she meant, until now, hearing you ask about the palace." She retrieved the box from a back room, setting it carefully on the table between them. Inside were old photographs, a few pieces of simple jewelry, and a folded letter, its handwriting matching perfectly with the unsigned letter Marcus had found inside the hidden closet. "She wrote a version of this letter more than once," Grace explained softly. "I always assumed it was addressed to someone she loved deeply, someone she was never able to properly say goodbye to." Marcus read through the letter carefully, and this time, with the full context gathered from Margaret, Henry, and Grace combined, the story finally began to take clearer shape. Eleanor Rowan had been a young woman closely connected to the royal family, likely a daughter born outside the bounds of formal recognition, kept quietly within palace walls until a decision was made regarding her future, one she strongly opposed. Rather than accept whatever arrangement had been planned for her, she had been quietly removed from the palace and sent to live in obscurity, her existence carefully erased from official records to protect the family's reputation. "She loved someone," Grace said quietly, watching Marcus read the letter. "Someone she was forbidden from choosing for herself. That's the closest I ever came to understanding her sadness." Marcus looked up. "Do you know who he was?" Grace shook her head. She never said, but she kept a small portrait among her things, of a young man she never explained. Perhaps that's who the letter was truly meant for. She retrieved a small, worn photograph from the box, showing a young man with a warm, open smile, dressed simply, clearly not part of the formal royal circles Eleanor had been born into. It painted a picture of forbidden love, of a young woman forced to choose between her heart and the expectations placed upon her by a family more concerned with appearances than happiness. As Marcus and Beatrice thanked Grace and prepared to leave, promising to share anything further they learned, Marcus felt the full weight of Eleanor's story settle over him. She had not simply disappeared due to scandal or misfortune. She had been erased because she dared to want something different for herself, something the royal family had been unwilling to allow. But even with this much uncovered, one crucial question remained unanswered. Who exactly had made the decision to send her away, and why had someone gone through such extensive effort, decades later, to ensure her story stayed buried? Marcus suspected the answer led directly back to Arthur Whitmore, and possibly to secrets far larger than a single forbidden love affair. As they left the coastal town and began their journey back toward the palace, neither Marcus nor Beatrice noticed the black car parked quietly near the edge of the harbor, watching their movements with careful, practiced patience. Someone had indeed been paying close attention to their search, and their next move would determine just how far they were willing to go to protect a secret that had remained hidden for decades. The moment Marcus returned to the palace, he sensed the shift immediately. Charlotte met him at the staff entrance, her expression tight with worry, rather than her usual composed calm. "Edmund wants to see you," she said quietly. "Immediately. And Marcus, he wasn't alone when he asked for you. Arthur Whitmore is with him." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, though he kept his expression steady as he followed Charlotte through the palace corridors toward the administrative offices. Beatrice had returned separately, and Marcus hoped she had enough sense to remain quiet about their trip until they understood exactly what awaited them. Inside Edmund's office, the atmosphere felt colder than usual, despite the warm afternoon sunlight filtering through the tall windows. Edmund sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled together, while Arthur Whitmore stood near the window, his posture just as rigid and controlled as it had appeared in the old photograph Marcus had seen days earlier. "Sit down, Marcus," Edmund said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. Marcus remained standing. "I'd rather stand, if that's all right." Arthur turned slowly from the window, studying Marcus with an expression that gave away nothing. "You've been busy," he said simply, "traveling, asking questions, digging through records that were sealed for very good reasons." "I found a room that shouldn't have existed," Marcus replied carefully. "A dress belonging to someone the palace seems to have deliberately forgotten. I only wanted to understand why." "Curiosity is a dangerous thing," Arthur said, his tone calm but edged with quiet warning, "especially when it involves matters far more complicated than a simple dress." "Then help me understand," Marcus said. "Who was Eleanor Rowan, and why was she erased so completely from this palace's history?" A heavy silence filled the room. Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward Arthur as though waiting for permission to speak. Arthur, however, remained composed, his gaze fixed steadily on Marcus. "Eleanor was a member of this family," Arthur finally admitted. "Born under circumstances the family considered inconvenient. She was raised quietly within the palace, given every comfort, but never publicly acknowledged as she should have been. And when she fell in love with someone the family didn't approve of," Marcus continued, "you had her sent away." Arthur's jaw tightened slightly. It was decided that her happiness could not come at the expense of the family's reputation. There were arrangements already in place for her future, arrangements she refused to accept. "So instead of allowing her a choice, you erased her existence entirely," Marcus said, his voice steady, despite the anger building beneath his calm exterior. "You destroyed records, sealed off a room, and let everyone who might remember her fade into silence." "It was necessary," Arthur said firmly, "for the family's stability, and yes, for my own position within it as well. I will not apologize for decisions made to protect something greater than one young woman's romantic feelings." Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but he forced himself to remain calm, aware that losing his composure now would accomplish nothing. "She had a daughter," Marcus said quietly. "Eleanor built a life for herself, away from all of this. She found happiness eventually, despite everything you took from her." For the first time, something flickered across Arthur's expression, a brief crack in his otherwise controlled demeanor. "I did not know that," he admitted softly, almost to himself. Edmund cleared his throat, breaking the tension slightly. "Marcus, understand that this situation extends far beyond a simple matter of curiosity. There are still members of this family who would be deeply affected if this story became public. Reputations, relationships, even matters of inheritance could be disrupted." "I never intended to make anything public," Marcus said honestly. "I only wanted to understand the truth." "And now that you understand it," Arthur said, his composure returning, "I trust you understand as well why it must remain contained. The dress, the letter, the room itself, none of it should ever leave this palace's walls in any official capacity." Marcus studied the older man carefully, sensing the underlying threat woven carefully beneath his measured words. Whatever authority Arthur still held within palace circles, it clearly remained significant enough to make even Edmund visibly nervous. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "To the room, the dress, everything we found?" "It will be resealed," Edmund said, quietly, without further discussion. "And you, Marcus, given the sensitivity of what you've uncovered, will be reassigned to a different section of the palace, away from areas where such discoveries might occur again." Marcus felt a flash of anger at the clear attempt to remove him from the situation entirely, to quietly push him aside, just as Eleanor herself had once been pushed aside decades earlier. "With respect," Marcus said carefully, "I don't think simply sealing that room again solves anything. Eleanor Rowan existed. She lived, she loved, she built a life despite everything taken from her. Hiding her story away again feels like repeating the same mistake all over." Arthur studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What exactly are you suggesting, Marcus?" "I'm not asking for a public scandal," Marcus said. "I understand the family's concerns, but there's a difference between protecting privacy and erasing someone's existence entirely. Surely there's a way to honor what happened, quietly, respectfully, without exposing anyone to unnecessary embarrassment. Edmund and Arthur exchanged a long look, some unspoken understanding passing between them. "I will need to think carefully about this," Arthur finally said. "You've uncovered something I believed buried permanently, Marcus. That is no small thing, but rushing toward any decision now would be unwise." "I only ask that whatever decision is made," Marcus said, "it considers Eleanor's memory with more compassion than the original decision did." Arthur nodded slowly, though his expression remained guarded. "I will consider your words. For now, however, I must insist that both you and your archivist friend cease any further investigation into this matter. Agreed?" Marcus hesitated, glancing briefly toward Charlotte, who remained silent near the doorway, her expression carefully neutral despite the tension filling the room. "Agreed," Marcus finally said, though the word tasted bitter as he spoke it. As Marcus left the office, his mind raced with uncertainty. He had uncovered the truth behind Eleanor Rowan's disappearance, confirmed the involvement of a powerful advisor still active within palace affairs, and learned of a daughter carrying forward pieces of a story the family had tried desperately to erase. Yet despite everything uncovered, the resolution remained entirely out of his hands, dependent on the goodwill of a man who had already proven himself willing to erase an entire life to protect the family's reputation. That evening, Beatrice met him quietly near the archive entrance, her expression anxious as she waited for an update. "What happened?" she asked immediately. Marcus recounted the conversation carefully, watching Beatrice's expression shift from concern to quiet anger as he described Arthur's justification for what had happened to Eleanor. "So that's it?" Beatrice asked. "They just seal the room again, and everything goes back to being forgotten?" "Maybe not," Marcus said. "Arthur seemed affected when I mentioned Eleanor's daughter. I don't think he expected that detail. It might be enough to change how he handles this. Or it might make him more determined to keep things quiet," Beatrice countered. "Especially if a living descendant complicates matters of inheritance or family recognition." Marcus knew she was right to remain cautious, but he also sensed something shifting within Arthur during their conversation, a flicker of guilt or regret that had not been present when the conversation began. Whether that shift would be enough to change the outcome remained entirely uncertain. As they parted ways for the evening, Marcus found himself standing once more outside the sealed section of the East Wing, now fully closed off behind fresh brick and mortar, the hidden room disappearing once again behind palace walls. But this time, unlike decades before, someone remembered what lay behind that brick. Someone knew Eleanor's name, her story, and the daughter she left behind in a quiet coastal town. Whatever happened next, Marcus understood that Eleanor Rowan's silence had already been broken. The only question remaining was whether that broken silence would lead toward some form of quiet justice, or simply toward a more carefully guarded secret than before. 3 weeks passed with no word from Edmund or Arthur, and Marcus began to fear the silence meant the matter had simply been buried once more, exactly as it had been decades earlier. He continued his duties as usual, though now assigned to the palace's main entrance, rather than the quiet corridors of the East Wing, a subtle but clear message about where his responsibilities were expected to remain from now on. Then, one afternoon, Charlotte approached him during a break, an envelope in her hand marked with the royal seal. "This came for you," she said, handing it over carefully, delivered personally, not through the usual channels. Marcus opened the envelope to find a brief, formally written note requesting his presence at a private meeting the following morning, signed simply with Arthur Whitmore's name. No further explanation was given, leaving Marcus uncertain whether to feel hopeful or apprehensive about what awaited him. The next morning, he arrived at the designated meeting room, a quiet study tucked away in a rarely used section of the palace. Arthur was already there, standing near a window overlooking the palace gardens, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded, a noticeable shift from their previous conversation. "Thank you for coming," Arthur said, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat. I've spent considerable time thinking about our last conversation, and about Eleanor. Marcus sat down carefully, saying nothing, waiting for Arthur to continue. I made inquiries, Arthur admitted. Quiet ones, through trusted channels. I confirmed what you told me about Eleanor's daughter, her life in that coastal town, the family she built for herself despite everything taken from her. And? Marcus asked carefully. Arthur exhaled slowly, an unusual display of vulnerability from a man who had always projected careful control. I was young myself when the decision was made regarding Eleanor's future. I believed, at the time, that I was protecting the family, preserving something important, but confronting the full weight of what that decision cost her, cost an entire life she might have lived differently, has forced me to reconsider much of what I once believed necessary. Marcus remained quiet, sensing that Arthur needed space to continue without interruption. I have spoken with the family, Arthur continued. Carefully, discreetly, there remains genuine concern about public exposure, about scandal, about complications regarding matters of family standing. But there is also, now, a willingness to acknowledge Eleanor privately, to ensure her memory and her daughter's existence are recognized within family records, even if not publicly announced. What does that mean exactly? Marcus asked. It means, Arthur said, that Eleanor Rowan will be formally recognized within private family archives as a member of this family, her story documented honestly rather than erased. Her daughter, should she wish it, will be quietly informed of her true heritage, along with whatever support or acknowledgement she chooses to accept. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he remained cautious, aware that promises made in private conversations could still fail to materialize into meaningful action. And the dress? Marcus asked. The room? The room will remain sealed, Arthur said, for now at least. Some family members are not yet ready to face it directly, but the dress itself will be carefully preserved, catalogued honestly within private archives rather than left forgotten behind brick and mortar. It seemed the very least Eleanor deserved. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that this resolution, while imperfect, represented significant progress compared to the silence that had existed for decades prior. Thank you, Marcus said quietly, for reconsidering. Arthur studied him for a long moment. You have a persistent nature, Marcus. Most men would have let this matter rest the moment I asked them to. I find myself oddly grateful that you did not. Following their meeting, Marcus reached out to Beatrice immediately, sharing the news of Arthur's decision. Beatrice, though cautiously optimistic, insisted on confirming the details herself before fully believing the matter had been resolved honestly. Together, they arranged to visit Grace Whitfield once more, this time accompanied by a formal letter from Arthur himself, acknowledging Eleanor's place within the family and offering Grace the choice of how much, if any, further contact she wished to maintain with relatives she had never known existed. When they arrived at the small bakery near the harbor, Grace read through the letter slowly, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of her mother's history became fully clear to her for the first time. She never told me any of this, Grace said softly, tears gathering in her eyes. She protected me from all of it, I think, wanting me to have a simple, happy life, free from whatever pain she carried. She built that life beautifully, Marcus said gently. Whatever happened to her, whatever was taken from her, she still found happiness in the end. That matters, more than any formal recognition ever could. Grace nodded, wiping her eyes carefully. I would like to know more, eventually, about the family, about where I come from, but slowly, in my own time. Arthur, upon receiving word of Grace's response, agreed readily to respect whatever pace she wished to set, a small but meaningful sign that his change of heart extended beyond mere words into genuine action. Months later, Marcus found himself walking once more through the quiet corridors of the palace, his assignment eventually restored to the areas he had patrolled for years prior. Though the hidden room remained sealed, its secrets no longer felt buried in the same painful, forgotten way they once had. Somewhere within the palace's private archives, Eleanor Rowan's name now existed clearly, honestly, a small but permanent acknowledgement of a life once erased entirely. Marcus often thought of the dress hanging silently behind that brick wall, no longer forgotten, no longer without a name attached to its careful stitching. He thought of Grace, slowly opening herself to a heritage she had never known, choosing her own pace toward understanding a history far larger than she had ever imagined. And he thought of Eleanor herself, a young woman who had once been forced into silence but whose story, decades later, had finally found its way back into the light, carried forward by a chain of small, determined choices made by people who refused to simply let her memory fade away entirely. As Marcus prepared to retire from palace service several years later, he requested one final visit to the sealed section of the East Wing, a request Charlotte, now head of security herself, happily arranged. Standing before the same brick wall he had once broken open out of simple curiosity, Marcus reflected quietly on everything that single discovery had set into motion. He would never forget Eleanor Rowan, a woman he had never met, yet whose story had reshaped his understanding of the palace he had served faithfully for so many years. Behind every polished hallway and carefully maintained tradition, countless stories remained hidden, waiting quietly for someone curious enough and brave enough to finally let them breathe again. As he turned to leave the corridor one last time, Marcus felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him, knowing that somewhere within these walls, and within a small bakery near a distant harbor, Eleanor's story finally belonged to those who deserved to carry it forward.